May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts, may the actions of our lives be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Good morning. Wow, it is wonderful to be here this morning and to see so many old friends from so many parts of my life. This cathedral, I need you to know, is holy ground for me. Much of my spiritual formation as a young adult happened within these walls. Not only was I ordained right there, but when I was a student at your neighbor, the Union Theological Seminary, I served on the very first night watch staff. And I spent every Friday night of the school year with young people from all over the East Coast as they experienced majesty and mystery and fun within these walls. This is the place where I learned to play hide and go seek in a church, and where we decided that the high altar was in fact home base. And I carried that tradition with me to every church I ever served. The best part of the night for me would happen after the midnight mass up at that same high altar. And after everybody went to bed, and just before I got on the subway to go home, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, after the doors were locked and the lights were out and all there was light coming in from that rose window and some security lights, the guards would let me come into the middle of the nave, and there I would play my guitar and I would sing and I would say my prayers in the great dark silence of this space. So, Dan Daniels, thank you so much for extending me this invitation to return. The day I saw beneath dark clouds the passing light over the water, and I heard the voice of the world speak out, I knew then, as I had before, life is no passing memory of what has been, nor the remaining pages in a great book waiting to be read. It is the opening of eyes long closed. It is the vision of far-off things seen for the silence they hold. It is the heart, after years of secret conversing, speaking out loud in the clear air. It is Moses in the desert, fallen to his knees before the lit bush. It is the man throwing away his shoes as if to enter heaven and finding himself astonished, opened at last, fallen in love with solid ground. David White's poem, The Opening of Eyes, aptly describes Moses' encounter at the burning bush. The Moses story, a profound epic tale, is about being interrupted by God. It's about encountering the holy, called by name, given a sacred task, feeling unsure and unworthy, receiving reassurance, and in the end, saying yes. The story of Moses is an invitation to journey across dangerous waters, through barren deserts and into high mountains, getting lost and found in the wilderness of our lives. The epic tale of Moses features all of the elements of adventure: exile and exodus, challenge and resistance, excitement and boredom, mistakes and missteps, punishment and reward, courage and fear, anger and compassion, frustration and laughter, abandonment, forgiveness, and ultimately salvation. In 4 books of the Bible, and 40 years in the wilderness, the narrative of Moses presents to us the very essence of a life's journey. What happened to Moses can happen to each of us. If we are willing to shed the skin on our calloused feet, we can find ourselves astonished and opened by the mystery of the divine as we discover and as we fall in love with the ground of our being. Yes, each person's story is different. Everyone's call is unique. But when God interrupts our lives, we stand on holy ground. Sometimes, and sometimes not, aware of the angels all around. As a young rabbinic student explained to David White, the original Hebrew verb for take off your shoes is shed. It's the same verb that's used for an animal shedding its skin. In reflecting on this word study, White explains, so God says, shed your shoes. Say that 3 times. Shed your shoes, just as it would be a natural process to let it all go. And of course, when you're shedding, you don't look good for a while. But you've got to go through that lovely humiliation. When God interrupts our lives, when God calls us to shed our shoes, we're often called to pick up what feels like a cross, a terrible burden to bear that eventually becomes a blessing in disguise, an opportunity for growth and for grace. Carl Jung and Richard Rohr described this process of shedding as falling upward into the second half of life, discovering what Edith Wharton once called the fullness of life. The first half is about building a container called identity and filling that container with family and friends and education and career and hobbies and stuff. Lots of stuff. And we also fill our containers with hopes and dreams and ambitions and aspirations. The second half of life happens when, for various reasons, the contents of our identity container are spilled out and refined. And the container is now worn and dirty and chipped and perhaps even broken and reglued. That container is refilled. And now, with all of its contradiction and paradox, with all of its pain and joy, with all of its success and failure, we each hold our container in what Rohr calls luminos gravitas, a bright sadness. The second half of life is like a sacred dance when we become who we are really meant to be, beloved children of God. How do you get there, you might ask? How do you fall upward with all of the challenges of life that are so overwhelming? I think it goes something like this. God comes disguised as your life. And God says, shed your shoes, for you're standing on holy ground. And then God takes your shoes away and fashions them into a cross. And then God says, pick it up and come with me and do the work that I've given you to do. And because God is so gracious, God leaves a little bit of our shoes behind as sandals to protect our feet. God has profoundly interrupted my life twice. The first time was when I met God in a McDonald's on the corner of 42nd Street and Madison Avenue right here in New York City. It happened 35 years ago. And yet I can remember that moment like it was yesterday. The Spirit of God gently tapped me on the shoulder as if with the flat of a sword and claimed me with all of my foibles as beloved child. The divine voice then called me by name, confronted me with my own issues and private wounds, all that stuff that only you and I know that lives inside of us. And God contradicted my dearly held theological beliefs. And God answered my questions and challenged me to claim my vocation and reassured me when I protested. And like Moses, I was reluctant. I felt unworthy. I was scared. But I said yes. I accepted the divine invitation that I had received, and I ran with that dream of God for my life through some 3 decades of ministry in the Episcopal Church. And the second interruption happened in November of 2016. Election day, to be precise. When my spouse, Emily, and I sat in a doctor's office and heard the words, "Tracey, you have early-stage dementia, probably caused by frontotemporal degeneration, disease that I had never heard of." The doctor told me that if my condition followed its usual course, eventually I would become unable to speak, write, read, and understand language. Life as I knew it imploded in that doctor's office. Layers of callous skin began to molt away, and a new cross was formed out of the shards. My diagnosis ripped apart the fabric of our life, disrupted the core of my vocation, confronted the essence of my very identity. And it then drove us into the wilderness of dementia and disability and discernment. Like many who receive a devastating diagnosis, for months we sequence through those Kubler-Ross stages of grief over and over again like a washing machine cycle. After I retired from cathedral ministry, we traveled to Europe by way of a transatlantic cruise. And for nearly 4,000 nautical miles, I tried to come to terms with it all. And as we passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, navigating between the continents of Africa and Europe under the full moon of Holy Week, I kid you not, something inside of me shifted. And I found myself ready to face this new chapter of my life, to transform this interruption from a death sentence to a pilgrimage, from an intrusion to an invitation, from an exile to an exodus. I was determined in that moment that I would live what I had been preaching for over 30 years, that out of pain comes joy, out of brokenness comes wholeness, and out of death comes new life. My diagnosis of FTD granted me what the poet Denise Levertov describes as honor and a task. In what felt like an eternity to me, but a millisecond to God, I saw beneath the dark clouds of my diagnosis the passing light over the water, and I heard the voice of the world to speak out. It was calling me to find the meaning and grace and gifts and wisdom from a life impacted by dementia, and to speak about it from the inside out, and to become, in the words of my fellow pilgrim Greg O'Brien, a torchbearer, to curse the darkness of this disease and to shine a light on its path. Like David White, I knew then, as I had before, life is no passing memory of what has been, nor is it the remaining pages in a great book waiting to be read. It is the vision of far-off things, seen for the silence they hold. It is the heart speaking out loud in the clear air. I have no doubt that I am losing the life I've always known, but I am also certain that I'm finding a new one. Dante opens the Divine Comedy with these words: "In the middle of the journey of my life, I came to myself in a dark wood, wherein the direct way was lost." It is a hard thing to speak of how wild and harsh and impenetrable that wood was, so that thinking it recreates the fear. It is scarcely less bitter than death, but in order to tell of the good that I found there, I must tell you of the other things I saw there. Dante then takes us on an excruciating tour of the inferno of purgatory and paradise, and in his final vision, the poet sees the beam of the highest light. He emerges from the dark wood wherein the direct way was lost to dazzling light, the light of supreme love and truth, a burning bush that was not consumed. I know that I am falling upward into the fullness of my life with dementia. When I deny the reality of my disease, when I grieve the lost aspects of my old identity, when I resist the emerging aspects of the new me, I get tied up in knots. But when I accept what has died, when I let go of what has been lost, and when I celebrate what is being reborn, as I learn to love and to care for the person that is emerging, I am discovering surprising gifts and strengths, a new and different kind of balance, a deeper wisdom, and a new way of living in the world. And for this, I'm profoundly grateful. So this morning, I ask you to take off your shoes as you wonder, how is God interrupting your life? On what holy ground are you standing? What is your burning bush? How are you being invited to die to your old life in order to be born into a new one? And to what honor and sacred task are you being called? As you wrestle with these questions, remember the words of Paul. God is faithful and will not let you be tested beyond your strength, but with testing will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. And remember the divine presence of the burning bush, offering you the reassurance that you are never alone. So do not be afraid, but do take off your shoes, for it will make it harder for you to run away from the ground of your being and the invitation to the fullness of your life.